This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece on May 1st, 2024. Before I introduce our guest, I want to just wish the very best to our comrades in the working classes, the poor and the oppressed, the many fine people for whom May Day was established. I know that this is a day that is near and dear to the heart of my guest as well, Leith Marouf. Leith is an expert and a consultant in broadcasting law. He is a geopolitical analyst based in Beirut, Lebanon today. He has spent a good deal of time in Montreal, but we're going to be getting into that in a moment. Leith is also the executive director of Free Palestine TV, and a relatively new initiative, and it has been doing some very important reporting at or near the front lines of the resistance to Western Israeli hegemony in West Asia. So I do suggest, if you haven't familiarized yourself with Free Palestine TV, that you do so, and that you support the organization in any way you can. Thank you so much for joining me again, Leith.
Thank you for having me. Of course, happy May Day to all the working class around the world, people fighting imperialism, colonialism, capitalism, and Zionism. This day, of course, is celebrated everywhere around the world except in the United States and in Canada, where it's not an official holiday. It's a holiday here in Lebanon and in much of the world. So happy May Day to all our viewers.
And it is also a holiday here in Greece. And in fact, in Kalamata this morning, there was a march in honor of the workers of the world. So yes, as in so many ways, the United States and its Canadian vassal present themselves as an exception to traditions that are broadly respected around the world. But that's a subject for another day. I want to focus today on some late-breaking news. And that news is that, the bigger context of this news, of course, is that there has been a burgeoning, extraordinary movement, peaceful uprising on university campuses, not just in the United States, also in Canada, in West Asia. I know that it's happening in Lebanon. And there has been quite brutal methods been brought to bear to try to suppress these peaceful solidarity encampments that are being established on universities around the world, and particularly in North America. And the late breaking news that I wanted to start our discussion with today is that hours ago, a judge of the Quebec Superior Court rejected an application by two students at McGill University calling for or seeking an injunction which would have prevented Palestinian solidarity activists from peacefully protesting within 100 meters of the campus of McGill University. And this happened around the same time that the administration of McGill asked the police of Montreal to shut down an encampment that was recently set up by students there in solidarity with the Palestinian people. The police have not yet done that. It'll be interesting to see how they react to this judicial decision. But before we get into all of that, Leith, I'd like you to start by talking about McGill University. You know, you and I have had conversations about this character, Irwin Cotler, who you've referred to as the Grand Wizard of Zionism in Canada. And of course, he has deep ties to McGill University. Can you tell us a little bit, just so people understand, where does McGill fit in sort of the academic universe in Canada? And what kind of a role has it played in terms of promoting the Zionist agenda historically?
Well, obviously, McGill is the most famous university in Canada, outside Canada. It's recognized as the top of the Ivy League universities in Canada. And that's the reputation that it holds. And this is why the significance of this action on its campus. What does that mean? The other thing that our viewers need to know is McGill, the person who built the university, built it over stolen Indigenous Mohawk lands. And this was a theft that the Indigenous communities of Kahnawake and Kanesatake still ask for either reparations for or return for of these lands. And so the university itself is started over a colonial theft of land and ethnic cleansing project, as Israel is. And that is, I think, where the most important thing about everything that we're seeing right now, beyond the amazing work of these students and the courage that they're exhibiting and the professors behind them, is that the realization that many people are finally coming to of what Edward Said told us in Orientalism, his amazing, seminal book that is referenced when we talk about academia and its creation as a whole in the colonial process. All these sciences of anthropology and sociology and what have you, everything that was created, and administrative laws and blah, 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 that was created to manage the colonization process and figure out the mind of the indigenous that is being colonized and so forth. This is the issue here. Universities in the West are integral in the process of colonization, theft of resources in the world, and genocide as we see it happening now in front of us. And a lot of people are finally discovering that, seeing how the university administrations are collaborating with the police and with the authorities to suppress, the voices of students. McGill, with this case that you just brought up, maybe you want to talk more about this case and we can discuss it
Yes.
more.
Before we get into it, though, if you could tell us a little bit about the connections of, Irwin Cotler in particular, because he is such an influential figure in Zionism in Canada, his connections to this university.
Yes, I mean, there's the law department and, Irwin Cotler studying in this university and being given all this stature and degrees and, always touted as the epitome of what you can do in law in McGill, when he's in reality a big fraud. I mean, the biggest fraud issue is his claim to have represented the late, great liberationist leader Nelson Mandela.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And by proximity to this, with this ridiculous lie of a claim that is proven multiple times and lately by Read the Maple, I think is the website, the Maple. Well, did they change their name? They wrote a huge study of every reference that was ever made about Irwin Cotler claiming to have been the lawyer of Nelson Mandela. And they even went to the archives, got all access, not through being there, but communicated with the archives in South Africa and the museum and every record that ever showed about Irwin Cotler in South Africa, and there was zero. And so Irwin Cotler has been lying, claiming that he was the lawyer of Nelson Mandela, to be able to actually say then, well, because I was the lawyer of Nelson Mandela, I can tell you what's happening in Palestine is not an apartheid, it's not a genocide, the Israelis are great. And Nelson Mandela, that now he's dead, wouldn't stand with the Palestinians, although Nelson Mandela said the minute he walked out of jail, the first thing he said actually, and this is an amazing thing that everybody needs to know, that the freedom of South Africans is not complete without the freedom of Palestinians. Imagine that Nelson Mandela makes this as part of his first statements coming out of jail. So Irwin Cotler and McGill behind him and all these establishments behind him are all corrupt and part and parcel of the colonization process in Canada, the dispossession of the Indigenous people, the theft of their resources, the killing of their children, the disappearances of their women, the starlight tours of their men, and the genocide that is happening in Palestine.
Yeah, and I just want to point out to our listeners that Cotler is a professor emeritus at the McGill Law School, reputed to be one of the finest law schools in Canada. And I believe he's a visiting professor this year at the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill. And former Justice Minister of Canada, of course. And I have, along with Leith, in the interest of full disclosure, have butted heads with Mr. Cotler on a prior occasion. I, along with some other human rights activists, disrupted a speech by this character, Irwin Cotler, at the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies at Concordia University, another university in Montreal, a few years ago. And I and those who disrupted him were condemned by people in Canada's parliament, a number of MPs from the two main parties that have dominated Canadian politics in the post-World War II period, for having had the temerity to challenge this man's credentials in the sphere of human rights. This institute, the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies, which is in many ways a platform for Irwin Cotler to present himself as a leading figure in the struggle for human rights, has not said a word, nothing, about the genocide.
This institute is in McGill or at Concordia?
It's at Concordia.
Yes.
So it's not.
Can I tell you the story about this institute?
Oh, please.
How it came to be?
Please do.
So 2002, September 9, we shut down Netanyahu at Concordia University. We had already, as Palestinian rights activists, been in control of much of the student unions across all the biggest universities in Canada. This is the, what led it to the point of Netanyahu. But after the shutdown of Netanyahu, to get to the story here, we, as activists, came to Concordia University, had spoken to the leaders of business in the Arab and Muslim communities in Canada, and have gathered a $10 million endowment to open a Palestinian studies or an Arab studies or a Muslim studies program at Concordia University. Because at the time, by the way, 1/3 of the students at Concordia were either Arab or Muslim, okay? And the Concordia administration rejected the endowment, okay? And instead, they rushed to the Zionist to say, hey, this is the stronghold of this community, and we have just rejected them, an Arab Muslim Palestinian studies program at Concordia. Invest to create an Israeli and Holocaust studies program, institute. This is the spite that Zionists, have. And the whole purpose of this institute was to create this space where they can bring these nasty supremacist thinkers from around the world to have access to the students around the campuses in Montreal, which they fear. Many of these campuses and many of these students for decades have been the most vocal on Palestinian liberation. And Irwin Cotler and the ilk like him, those who are the leaders, the grand wizards of Zionism, were behind this. So it's also a money scheme for all of them to get jobs and continue sucking money from their own community, the Jewish community, instead of spending money on social services for their own children and elders, is being diverted that money for careers of perpetual pathological liars, genocide supporters like Irwin Cotler and others.
Yeah. And just imagine, you know, the name of the institute is the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. And on January 26th, the highest court in the United Nations system adjudged by a margin of 15-2, with every Western-based judge concurring in the decision, that it was plausible that Israel is committing genocide. And this so-called Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies has not said a word about the horrors being visited upon the people of Gaza before the eyes of the world. So this will give you an idea of the level of just outright fraud that we, you know, people who live in Montreal, love the city, want our city to be a better, welcoming place for the oppressed. This is the nonsense that we have to deal with. We have to deal with organizations like this that are basically bringing shame upon the whole cause of human rights in the community of Montreal. One other thing I want to mention before we get into this decision, Leith, and I'm going to play this little video clip for our listeners. I'll add it in after our discussion is concluded, just so you get a sense of what McGill University is in terms of, you know, the Zionist agenda in Canada. A couple of years ago, the McGill University Law School gave an honorary doctorate to a character by the name of Hillel Neuer, who is a graduate of McGill University Law School and is the executive director of an organization based in Geneva called UN Watch. And the singular purpose of UN Watch is to berate the United Nations anytime it ever says or does anything critical about Israel. That's the singular purpose. This man has devoted his entire life to browbeating the United Nations, which has utterly failed to defend the Palestinian people. It has been, from a rhetorical perspective, a staunch supporter of the Palestinian cause, and rightly so. But when it comes to actual measures to defend Palestinians, even during this genocide, the UN has been an abject failure, and in fact is complicit in the dispossession of the Palestinian people by effectively declaring the creation of Israel, and according to the minority population at the time of Jewish citizens, a majority of the land, and according to the indigenous Palestinian population, a minority of the land. So, you know, even though the UN has failed miserably to defend the Palestinian people, Hillel Neuer has devoted his entire career to castigating the United Nations. And I'm just going to play this clip. As I say, I'll add it in after our discussion is complete, but I think this will give people a sense of just how beholden the administration of McGill University is to the cause of Zionism, and how much it has done to damage the cause of Palestinian human rights in Canada. Now, with that as background, I'll say a few words about this decision and then ask you to comment upon it. The decision, I have not had the opportunity yet to actually read the judge's reasons. As I mentioned, they were released a few hours ago. But according to Canada's national broadcaster, the CBC, the two McGill students filed this request on Tuesday, so they got a very rapid hearing, to forbid protests within 100 meters of McGill's buildings. And the court filing named 5 pro-Palestinian groups. The plaintiffs allege that the groups have created an environment of hate on campus. Those were the words they used, which they say has made them uncomfortable to attend classes and exams. They also allege they have faced harassment and intimidation from the defendants, from these 5 Palestinian solidarity groups. And the judge wrote, The court is of the opinion that the balance of inconveniences leans more toward the protesters whose freedom of expression and to gather peacefully would be affected significantly. The judge pointed out that the plaintiffs had not themselves dealt with harassment, violent acts, or threats. So this is very important. The plaintiffs themselves were not able to testify that they themselves had been subjected to harassment, violent acts, or threats. She also wrote, the judge, that she only needed to consider the interests of the plaintiffs, not the public's. And I'm quoting here, even if the plaintiffs were deemed to be acting in the public interest, something the court does not have to consider, the evidence presented by the plaintiffs are insufficient. I'm interested in your thoughts on all of this, Leith. And if you could comment also and more broadly, whatever thoughts you may have about this decision and its implications, what does this say about the justice system in Canada, the so-called justice system and the cause of Palestinian human rights? Is this a reason for those of us who care deeply about the people who are being subjected to a genocide with the shameless complicity of Canada's government? Is this a reason for us to celebrate? Is Canada a place where we might finally be able to deliver justice to the Palestinian people?
Well, Canada is a very unique place amongst the colonial powers in the West, or provinces of the empire ruled from DC, because it has two competing elites from two different groups that are, the French and the English, that are constantly bickering about who is more oppressed by the other. Okay. So in most other parts of the empire, like the US, there's one group that has been homogenized. Let's say in the US is white, or in France it's the French, and Germany it's the Germans. Okay. There's no competing elite. In this situation of a competing white squabble that's happening, it allows, interestingly, because of that, the ability for communities that are weaker, or that are the minorities, and so forth, to actually step between that interest battle. Okay, there is no schism in the American elite. It plays out in media politics, but in reality, they're all agreed they're gonna gang up against the quote unquote black people, the Latinos, and everybody's okay. In Canada, they're competing, and because of this competition, we see sometimes the courts, specifically in Quebec, more so than in any other place in Canada, give rulings that are supportive of Palestinians just to spite the English part of the country, literally. Solidarity for Palestinian Human Rights, the student group on campuses that is included in the McGill encampment right now, that we were a part of, starting at the late 90s, early 2000s, appeared in court at least 7 times in Quebec against Zionists, against arrests, against, and every time we won in Quebec, actually. And it's clearly playing out in that term. When you go in the rest of Canada, because there is no battle, let's say in Ontario, between French and English, and there's a homogeneity between the Zionist elite that are Jewish and the Zionist elite that are Christian or secular, they're all homogenized. There is not much leeway for Palestinians to win court cases in Ontario.
Interestingly, the Quebec courts, on the whole, relative to the courts of Canada, as I think you're quite right, they've been, for whatever reason, more sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. There was, for example, um, during the mayoralty of Denis Coderre, who I think can fairly be described as a fanatical Zionist, when he was the mayor of Montreal, in the election, I believe it was in 2016, city officials were uh, began tearing down posters that were put up, and they had been approved by Elections Canada, these posters, which were highlighting Israel's war crimes against Palestinians. So posters approved by Elections Canada and Denis Coderre, under his administration, people went out, city officials, and were tearing down these posters. They had been set up by the Canadian Communist Party and a group called, I think it's called Palestinian.
Palestinian Jewish Unity.
Correct.
Yeah, and it's Bill Sloan, William Sloan, who was a very famous rights lawyer, human rights lawyer, and defendant lawyer, and he's retired now, and he was running for the Communist Party, and he gave his space on these posters for the issue of Palestine to take, and of course they took them down, and it ended up in court, as you were trying to mention, I think, and I cut you off. I'm sorry about that.
That's
You can
okay.
continue.
That's okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention Bill. I love Bill. I needed to mention his name.
I know Bill well. Bill has been a fearless advocate for the oppressed. Ultimately, a judge rendered a decision for the plaintiffs, the groups that whose posters were torn down, and they got some damages. It was nothing that was going to, shake the financial foundations of the city of Montreal, but symbolically it was important. But then on the other hand, there was a class action that was brought in the Montreal courts on behalf of, I believe it was Palestinian Canadians, against a Canadian corporation that was complicit in the settlement project in the West Bank, the occupied West Bank, which Canada itself recognizes to be a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. And in that case, the court said it invoked a doctrine called forum non-conveniens. It's just Latin for inconvenient forum, and said that although we may have jurisdiction over this case, we're going to defer to the courts of Israel, where in the court's opinion, it was possible for the plaintiffs to get justice. And that basically killed the case, of course, because there was no realistic prospect of the plaintiffs getting any justice in apartheid Israel. So on the whole, the courts of Quebec have been better than the non-Quebec courts when it comes to Palestinian rights. However, to say that the courts of Quebec have been a champion of Palestinian human rights, I think would be a bit of an overstatement. In any event, I'm curious to know, Leith, now you're very, very familiar with the political scene in Quebec, and particularly the question of Palestinian solidarity in the political scene in Quebec. What do you think is going to happen next now that this decision has been rendered? So you have this encampment on McGill University, the property. The McGill administration has called in the cops. The cops, I think it's fair to say, we're waiting to see what this judge is going to do. The judge has rejected the idea that there are grounds for the issuance of an injunction. If you were a betting man, what would you say is going to happen next to this encampment?
Yeah, you see, I think the Zionists were stupid to take it to court, because as we saw in the United States, they skipped that stage and they abused their political power by forcing the mayors and the governors to deploy directly the military at the order of the political class without involving the courts, because in the United States, the courts most probably would have also ruled that these encampments should stay. So First Amendment speech. So they knew that, the Zionists, and what they did is they abused their political power and mobilized the security forces on their behalf to suppress these demonstrations. And we see right now in the last few hours or last night how the police in Los Angeles withdrew out of from around the UCLA encampment and allowed hordes of thugs, of Zionist thugs, to met punishment on these youth in front of the whole world and in front of themselves as police officers. right? So what we saw in the United States is a total degeneration of all basics of natural justice, common law. All of that is thrown immediately because they knew that is a losing battle. If you're going for the core rights that are in the United States, for instance, this First Amendment, and or in Canada, the Charter of Rights and its guarantees for assembly and speech, these are not going to be taken light by most judges, okay? And it will bring all the biggest lawyers in every country to fight it in, okay? The mistake of the Zionists in Montreal is that they thought that they even can use courts. Sometimes I feel the Canadian Zionists are more delusional even than the American Zionists. The isolation, the geographic isolation in Canada and the bubble in Canada that is, you know, I've traveled all the world, sat down and lived in so many places, watched so much of those local medias, but I've never felt as isolated from the rest of the world.
We've lost your image. Leith, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I'm now trying to.
Yeah. So yeah, if we can't get your image, Leith, this is bizarre. This is the second time this happened to us. We had to abort our first attempt at this interview for those of you who are watching because this happened. But in any event, Leith, if you're not able to restore your image, please feel free to continue.
Yeah. Just want to make sure the audio is working.
I can hear you clearly.
Yeah.
There you go.
Here we go.
We have you back.
Okay.
Sorry. So you were talking about the bubble.
Yeah, so the bubble in Canada, you know, makes people like the Zionists even themselves in Canada feel that they can do anything they want to, right?
Yeah,
And
I just want to interject because I have to concur with you. This is something I just got to get off my chest. I lived in the United States for a number of years. I lived in Australia. I lived in France. I spent a lot of time in Greece, where I have a second home. And like you, I've traveled widely. And I have to say, with the greatest of respect to our siblings in Canada, that I too have never seen a country, a society. Of course, there are exceptions. There are people in Canada, especially anti-imperialists, who are keenly aware of what is happening in the world and have a sophisticated understanding. So I'm talking in a generality here. The level of ignorance amongst many Canadians about what is happening beyond their borders is astonishing to me, having been around the world. And I think that this, you know, it has a lot to do with a culture of, shall we say, servitude to the Anglo-American Empire, which is something that has been, it's taught to Canadians at a very young age, just to sort of blithely accept the narratives about what is happening in the world. That
yeah, it's also part of it is the geographic isolation.
Sure.
Canada is a huge country.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And people, if they travel inside Canada. And I feel like Canadian media is so, you know, separate, so bland, so created. And there's an iron curtain almost of information from the rest of the world. So this creates in one part, let's say, something like ignorance, but it also creates in somebody like a Zionist a total disassociation from reality. And because they have somebody like what's her name, the crazy conservative Zionist loudmouth. Yes, Melissa Lansman. They don't only have Melissa Lansman, they have a horde of them in the parliament that are barking like that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And they therefore, these few crazies that decided to take this case to court, they only felt that they can win this court case with shoddy evidence of like, I feel hurt, I feel scared. And the judge is asking, what evidence do you have that you're threatened? Well, I don't know, just my feelings. Okay, but the bubble made this Zionist think that his feelings, because the media is also regurgitating the feelings of the Zionists, the feeling of the Zionist students, the feelings of the Zionists here, the feeling of the Zionists there. Well, it's repeated so often that this Zionist actually thought his feelings are court-worthy evidence to strip a whole generation of students of their right to assembly and their right to speech. Okay, that's the bubble that made this, this Zionist think this. So I don't think that would have happened in the U.S. There's no bubble in the U.S. There's clear confrontations between anti-Zionists and Zionists for decades, and things are not, and courts, so many court fights, and they've lost so many times. The Zionists, they know they can't do that. You know how many times they passed the BDS bans at different states in the United States, and they got taken to court, and every time they had to change the anti-BDS laws. They know there's a waste. They moved immediately into the Gustavo situation of beating the hell out of the students and deploying security forces on them.
Yeah. And so let's talk more broadly about what's happening on university campuses, not just in Montreal. I have a bee in my bonnet about some mythologies about the West, which even sometimes infect thinking within the progressive community. And three mythologies that I think have been utterly exploded by the events on the ground, and frankly by the horrific sacrifices that the Palestinian people have been forced to make in the struggle against fascism, are first of all that we have a society, our societies, for all of their flaws, and as I say, I found that fellow progressives, people on the left who identify as leftists, often will articulate this perspective in some manner, that whatever the flaws may be of Western societies, and they readily acknowledge that there are serious flaws, and that there is oppression and there's racism and so forth, nonetheless, we have more free speech than peoples in the non-Western world. That's one mythology, what I regard as a mythology. Another one is that there's less corruption in our societies. They acknowledge there's corruption, but it's not nearly as bad as the non-Western world. And finally, they ascribe to this view that even though, yes, we have an unjust economy, we're better at economic management. And the reason why we have so much more material wealth than most countries in the non-Western world is because we're much more competent from a sort of fiscal economic management perspective. And I think this is all bullshit, just total bullshit. I've been around the world enough to know that, the non-Western world is a very diverse place. It's not monolithic, but you can find countries in the non-Western world where there's at least as much free speech, if not more so, and where there is better economic management than you find in the West, and there are lower levels of corruption. So I think that one of the things that is emerging from what is being done to the Palestinian people with the full-throated support of Western political and economic elites and media elites has just completely obliterated these mythologies. And I want to focus in on this whole notion of free speech. Like you live in Lebanon, okay?
Yeah.
You've been in the non-Western world, and you've lived here. And you've seen it at a time when it wasn't quite as oppressive as it is today. Do you really think there is anything to this nonsense? I guess I'm prejudging the question. We have freer speech in the West than they do in the non-Western world. I mean, seriously?
Without exaggeration, after living on, 3 continents and visiting 5 continents, okay, I believe there is no more freedom of speech in any country on this planet than Lebanon. Okay.
Why do you say that? That's very interesting.
Okay. So, I brought up the idea of that there's a competing elite in Canada, the Francophones and the Anglophones, and they're fighting over each other. Who's more oppressive to the other? Imagine, two white groups fighting about that, and then everybody. Anyways, and how that creates space for, while they're bickering, others to escape this and make a voice. Well, in Lebanon, the French left a sectarian constitution, and that forces representation for 18 different sects from 3 religions, okay, to have representation in the parliament, representation in the jobs of the government, representation in everything, okay? And it's sectarianized in this way. So this colonial ill meant that eventually that we have now parties that represent all of these different things. And each party has its own newspaper and his own radio and his own TV station, and or each sect has that. You understand? So now what do you have? You have a total anarchy, first off, in terms of there is no state. Lebanon is the best example of how can you have a successful anarchist state, okay? There is no real state, but everybody is calling everybody names. Everybody is showing the dirty laundry of the other, right? Right? And so if you want any side, you want pro-Israeli, pro-American, you can find the Lebanese channel like that. Lebanon is 4 million citizens here, and they have more TV stations than Canada. Okay, in Canada, you have 3-4 networks in English. You have CBC, CTV, Global, CP24. In the French, you have another like RDI, TQS, TVA. I think there's in Lebanon here. You're talking about 10 different stations for at least for 4 million people. Canada is 33 million. And in Canada, and in fact, most of these national broadcasters, all of them agree on the main lines of, there's one Canada that has to be part of the Western alliance that colonizes everybody else and forces democracy, through stealing your resources.
Yeah. It's actually 39 million, by the way. So we're talking about large multiple of the population of
yes. And add to it, the Lebanese population is exposed to all the propaganda from every country around it, plus every colonial power in the world is broadcasting in Arabic to it, and in English and in French. Okay. And they're all broadcast. So people here are consuming the widest array of media possible.
Right.
While in Canada, you're in the periphery, everything is concentrated. You're behind the 2 oceans, and you're right beside the empire and imperial core of the United States. And the media is so homogenized.
Right. And there's despite what is said, there's no meaningful influence being exercised by, for example, the Chinese media, the Russian media, the Iranian media, the official enemies of the West on Canadians. They get virtually no exposure, none. And they've been largely, the moment that Russia invaded Ukraine, the one, RT was immediately removed. Not that many people were watching it, had very little audience in Canada. And, it was basically already characterized effectively as a Russian propaganda.
In my 7 years of CRTC appearances, the hearing to shut down RT, by the way, RT wasn't even broadcasting in Canada, but nobody was carrying it on their,
Whereas they were carrying it, you could watch RT in the United States, right? but you couldn't
Yes,
on television. You couldn't
yeah.
watch in Canada the
But
so-called
they were
mainstream.
preempting it, going above and beyond anybody else in the Western Alliance, imperial lands. And what did they do? Usually there is a period when the CRTC puts a file to the public, and there is a 30-day period for people to study what's there and deliver their opinions on this file to the hearing. They did an emergency, 15 days. This is the most important issue to come in front of the CRTC, and without prompting from anybody but the government of Canada. It's not like somebody made a complaint against RT and the CRTC had to investigate, is RT doing something racist? Is the RT providing factual information or not? Okay. It was just an order from the government to what is supposed to be a arm's length independent judiciary body that has the power of a superior court, superior federal court. This is what the CRTC is, that is empowered to educate the right to free speech on broadcast in Canada, gets an order from the government to have a hearing on the right of RT to be carried on cable distributors in Canada. 15 days, nothing on the file, and no public hearing, and judgment faster than any file ever at the CRTC, banning it forever from the internet, even blocking the IP addresses.
Right. And in the meantime, we are bombarded in Canada 24/7 with American propaganda. 24/7. You know, ABC, CBS, NBC, MSNBC, CNN, Fox News. This is all over the airwaves in Canada. And even the Canadian, the so-called Canadian networks, a lot of their content is American. They not necessarily their news content, but their so-called entertainment, which is itself a form of propaganda. What are people watching on Canadian television? You know, the vast majority of the time they're watching American propaganda. But no one ever says, no one suggests in the mainstream discourse that the United States is interfering in Canadian politics or manipulating Canadian public opinion. Instead, we're supposed to be worried about RT and the Chinese media and the Chinese government and so forth, that they are somehow nefariously overcoming this enormous influence that the American political and media elites have over public opinion in Canada, even though almost nobody watches them and don't even have access to them other than, you know, going onto some obscure sites on the internet and perhaps finding them with some significant effort. I mean, I think this whole would you agree with the idea that maybe now, as we watch this utter brutality being visited upon these peaceful protesters on these campuses, these young people who are simply protesting a goddamn genocide, that maybe finally we will dispense with this notion that we have freer speech in the West than exists in the non-Western world? Or do you think it's going to take more than this for us to finally be disabused of this mythology?
Yeah, no, I think we are heading to worse days. What we're just seeing happening is the beginnings of what I think will be is a summer of discontent. And we will see what happened in 1968 and 1969 across Europe and North America and those campuses repeating, but at a bigger scale. Because I don't think we saw, even in those days, the police allowing thugs in front of cameras and in front of their own presence to dispense this judgment, kind of, you know, and having governors and members of Congress talk about throwing people off bridges and telling people to take things into their own hands at this first stage. It's not like it's been 6 months of demonstrations or what have you, or just like the first days of student demonstrations on campuses, and we're already at, you know, one hair away from the Kent State massacre. Snipers already there. So I think what's coming next is much worse, and the communities should be ready for this. And if we see how Melissa Landsman is fundraising for a thug gang, a Zionist thug gang in the Toronto area that is now has its own police, you know, quote unquote police ban.
Do you know the name of this organization?
I don't have the name in my head, but she's taking pictures with them and standing like this with them, you know, and this is basically their community security protection force.
I just
So
saw, by the
now,
way, a video. Maybe you're talking about the same organization. I just saw a video on Twitter of a character who was he had the microphone before a meeting of the Toronto Police Services Board, a Zionist, and he said that we have armed ourselves. And he was cut off by the secretary of the meeting. He didn't really get into it, but he was telling them that we have firearms now to protect ourselves, to quote unquote protect ourselves from these dastardly peaceful protesters who are objecting to a genocide.
So the police know. You see, if he's already sitting in this meeting, I can tell you for sure the police know that these gangsters have already gotten their hands on arms, that they have the backing of some of the biggest financiers in the Toronto area, that they have the backing of MPs like this. I am sure also that CSIS and the RCMP already also know.
Just for our viewers,
I
CSIS
remember,
is the Canadian equivalent of the CIA or the NSA, and the RCMP is the Canadian equivalent of the FBI, basically. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, and I remember, by the way, from the time when the head of the JDL, a Jewish Defense League, just to show you how these things work, the late Irv Rubin, okay, who you know, when we shut down Netanyahu, and actually when I got expelled in 2001, right after September 11, right before September 11,
just so because people may know.
University.
Sorry. Oh yes, I was just going to invite you to explain to people what you meant by expelled. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was summarily expelled at an order from the president of the university just a few weeks before September 11. I was the first elected Arab to any executive of a student union in Canada, and the Zionists were coming for my blood, basically. And I had the unfortunate situation of that it happening just before September 11. Point is, Irv Rubin, the JDL, the Jewish Defense League, is the only Jewish organization on the FBI terrorist list, and it is the North American arm of the Kahanist movement in Israel. And the Kahanists are the fascists that want to completely genocide, and Itamar Ben-Gvir, the Minister of Internal Security right now in the Zionist colony, is part of the Kahanist movement. Irv Rubin came to Concordia University and we didn't know this, look at this, we were receiving death threats and bomb threats at the university. There was 3 different bomb threats at the University of Concordia, and the police and the Concordia administration and the media hid it. 3 different bomb threats at Concordia after September 11, and these death threats from a group called, they call themselves the group to exterminate Palestinians. This guy, his muffler. Anyways, point is, when we went, one day we were having a press conference and we saw somebody we recognized, kind of the look, and we thought about it and we figured out it's Irv Rubin. So he had come from the United States, from New York, to actually bomb Concordia. So we go to the police and we talk to them, and the police in Montreal already knew. They said, we've been watching him. He has recruited at Concordia, but don't worry, he only recruited 5 people. Apparently, they don't understand, like 5 people is a terrorist cell enough to take down a whole block of a neighborhood. And don't worry, it's all good. Okay, so they have known that we're receiving death threats and bomb threats at Concordia for weeks, and they have not arrested him or his gang that he had recruited on campus in Montreal. A few weeks later, Irv Rubin ends up being arrested in the United States, planning to bomb the largest mosque in the United States in California, and 3 other locations, one of them being Concordia University. They had set up all the plans, and luckily, the FBI was better than the shitty Montreal police and the shitty Canadian services, security services, that purposefully allowed this thug to continue his activities in Montreal. And so he gets arrested, he gets put in trial, or while he's waiting on for his trial, the good brothers in the Nation of Islam in the jail throw him out from the window from the 2nd floor. And end of the story. Irv Rubin his story ended with the vigilante justice that he was meting on others. And by the way, JDL killed an American Arab congressman in the 1980s, and tried to bomb Edward Said's office and firebombed it. And, you know, it was in Colombia. This is, so right now, the JDL is in Toronto, led by thugs that Irv Rubin had recruited 20 years ago. One of them being this Mir Weinstein, that leads the JDL in Canada and has been seen with Melissa Lantzman and the police and this new community security force that they created.
Mhm.
So the police
So I just
know
want to
that they're
interject
threatening our lives.
Yeah, so to people understand this odious character, Mayor Weinstein, what he's all about. He attended at York University in Toronto a couple of years ago with some other Jewish Defense League thugs, an event organized effectively to promote the Israeli media. And there was a large protest in the building. Palestinian solidarity activists showed up, and there was a large protest in the building against this event. The thugs, as was evidenced by videos that were taken both by pro-Israel students and pro-Palestinian students, attacked the protesters. They didn't attack the thugs, but the thugs claimed that they had been attacked by the pro-Palestinian protesters, and they even claimed that they were chanting, over 100 of them, Jews to the ovens, even though they didn't have any evidence of this whatsoever. I was actually hired, and I acted as counsel on a pro bono basis to a number of the pro-Palestinian students. And I think we demonstrated to the satisfaction of the university. There was an internal investigation. They got a former judge of the Supreme Court of Canada, Thomas Cromwell, to do a review. At the end of the day, I think they accepted readily that this claim that people had been chanting Jews to the ovens was a total fabrication. It was a total fabrication. There was 0 evidence, not one witness. Jewish persons who participated in the protest against the promotional event for the Israeli media themselves confirmed that they never heard that said by anybody. And the upshot of all of that, surprisingly, at the end of the day, was that York University banned Mayor Weinstein from its campus. And that was 3 years ago, 4 years ago. But now the tide has turned so much in favor of the fascist elements within the outright fascist elements within the Zionist community, that Mayor Weinstein has almost been rehabilitated. I mean,
No, yeah.
they were avoiding him before. He was almost radioactive. Even Zionist politicians were at least not openly cavorting with the man. But now he's like, they have no shame in openly associating with Mayor Weinstein and characters like Mayor Weinstein. And I think that ultimately is one of the many reasons why I think you're right. Sadly, Leith, we are heading for much worse than what we've seen thus far. This is going to be a summer of discontent, and people need to be prepared for tactics that are probably going to be considerably more brutal than those that pro-Palestinian protesters have had to deal with thus far during the genocide. And this takes me to my final question about the future. I want to talk a little more about the future, and I want to frame my question by talking about a movement that was very near and dear to my heart, but that was snuffed out violently, and that is the Occupy Wall Street movement. For those who may not be, if we have really young listeners, they may not be particularly familiar with the Occupy Wall Street movement, which really had its heyday back in 2010, 2011. And it was born in a place called Zuccotti Park in Manhattan, which is in the Wall Street district. And they set up an encampment there, and it began to grow. Very similar to what we're seeing now. It began with popular outrage at the massive fraud that was perpetrated by elite bankers and how that had brought the global economy to its knees. And so many people lost their homes and lost their jobs in the United States and in other countries. Encampments started springing up everywhere. It started in the United States, Zuccotti Park, goes all over the United States, then it comes to Canada. And there are encampments in Montreal, Occupy in Toronto, and Occupy in London, Ontario, where I was practicing law at the time. And during the Obama administration, you could see the bankers and the elites were getting very uncomfortable with all of this. And there's just, within a matter of, I think, a few weeks, they sent in the cops all around North America and shut it down, using tactics very similar to the ones that are being employed today. And the question that I have for you is, because I'm quite worried about this. I'm worried that the movement we are seeing now is going to get snuffed out by a wave of police brutality. What do you think this is different this time, or do you think there's a real danger that this university student movement, this wonderful uprising of solidarity with the people being subjected to genocide, is at risk of suffering the same fate as Occupy Wall Street?
Look, I had worked for a long time in media production, print, radio, and television. And in 2012, I was the executive director at a community television station in Montreal called CUTV. And before what became the strike, the student strike in Quebec, and what was at the time eventually called the Maple Spring, had understood that there's going to be this big strike. And I looked at the experiment of the Occupy movement. And I looked at the experiment of what was also fresh at that point and what actually influenced the Occupy movement, which is the quote-unquote Arab Spring. Okay. And in both cases, my analysis was about how did these movements use media, and or how did media use them, and or what was the role of media, and specifically broadcast media, in their fate. Okay. In the situation of the quote-unquote Arab Spring, the mainstream media was Al Jazeera, broadcasting from top of the building onto the crowd and showing you the square where the gathering was happening, and then having video clips from what's happening on the ground being brought to the broadcast. So nothing was live on the ground. And the government that controlled Al Jazeera influenced basically ultimately the direction of this Arab Spring and brought in the replacements that are pro-Qatari into the countries that, you understand what I mean? So the government that owned that broadcast media controlled the fate of this movement. In the situation of the Occupy, they had what was the beginning of this individual broadcasting, okay, of live streaming. You know, that was the beginnings of it, of people using their cell phone and or their laptop hooked up to their cell phone and walking around in the Occupy location and talking to people, and or the raw footage that doesn't have any journalistic packaging or direction or motivation for the viewer, that is just showing you the violence of clashes, or some would call it riot porn. Okay. And so when you, and ultimately the failure for the Occupy was their inability to provide the audience with a full understanding of what's happening, or giving them a visual that is fully professional and or journalistic packaging for the thing. And that means they couldn't compete with mainstream media that had its own agenda, and then what we saw the end result of it. In the experiment of CUTV, we decided to go live broadcasting on cellular, but using the multiplexing, multi-SIM card machines with a full professional camera setup and a full professional journalistic packaging, speaking to you and showing you what's happening from the ground. So we did better than what Al Jazeera was doing from being on top of a building, by being inside the crowd and the movement. And we did better than Occupy by providing the professional technical and professional journalistic packaging. And what did that result in? CUTV had more viewers. This little community TV station in Montreal had more viewers on it, on watching, than all the combined national broadcasters during their viewing hours. You know, there was 250,000 simultaneous unique IP viewers. The most watched broadcast for CBC, the national news hour, is 60,000 viewers. They're at their top. Can you imagine that? How disgraceful for a national broadcaster that has a budget of $2.5 billion to have only 60,000 viewers on there. But no matter, CUTV was able to reach, and thus that kept the movement alive. The movement, any movement needs motivation, needs to not be demotivated by the constant attack from the media. If you provide to this movement a live broadcast with this packaging that is championing their rights and repeating and doing interviews with them on the street for 8 hours, we were broadcasting from CUTV a day minimum. And you'd hear one interview after another from the people themselves telling their story. And then it becomes an echo chamber that lights a movement on fire, you know, any attack and any moment that is happening, and the journalist is telling you, and you're hearing the voices, and it's not just the riot porn, and you're talking about it, then that brings people in. People were coming out to the streets by just noticing which corner the CUTV team was on, and they will rush to meet the CUTV team on it. So the point is, the movement right now, not only the campus movement for the liberation of Palestine, but the movement of liberation as a whole in North America, it does not have a media delivery capability like this that could allow it to flourish and be able to compete with the messaging of the mainstream media and win. Look, the majority of Canadians and the majority of Americans are actually against the genocide. right now. If there is a broadcasting capability like we did in CUTV, we can take, the majority of the Canadian and American viewers will come to us to watch what's happening, and then will be motivated to take action. This is what led to the strike in Quebec to become the longest strike in the history of Canada, the student strike. Usually strikes in Canada don't last a month and a half because of the shitty cold weather, right? Because of this broadcast of CUTV live from the streets, the strike lasted almost 7 months and led to the collapse of the government of Quebec, okay? It was 6,000 students arrested, hundreds injured. All the security resources of the state were overstretched, and the whole country was gonna degenerate into much worse situation. So I would say we need this, and maybe we can ask our viewers right now, if we launch a live broadcast capabilities from these encampments, would our viewers donate to it? Free Palestine TV is ready to take it to the next level and go to the campuses in North America for this broadcast. We need seed money. We need to raise around 150,000 to launch ourselves and make it roll across the country. Go to the website, freepalestine.video. I think we should all put our money together where our mouth is, because as you see, they will met the worst kind of violence possible on these students, and nobody's seeing it live. Nobody's getting motivated into taking action to end it. In fact, these videos that we keep on seeing online of students getting beaten up are demoralizing for people if we don't see a win.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Leith. Fascinating as always. Thank you for taking time to speak with me. If I can dig it up, I'm going to conclude this report with a clip from our disruption of that clown Hillel Neuer when he was given an honorary doctorate at McGill University, just so people can get a taste of what the political environment is on that particular campus where this struggle is unfolding today. And this is Dimitri Lascaris reporting from Kalamata, Greece, speaking today with Leith Marouf on May Day 2024.
On your future path. This morning I would like to share with you what McGill has meant to me and my work in human rights, and to tell you about brave individuals on the front lines of this struggle. Let me begin by saying how profoundly grateful and touched I am. It's like I'm back at the United Nations.
As a university, McGill is committed
Stop justifying Israeli murder! Stop justifying Israeli murder! Stop justifying Israeli murder!